The voice on the airplane intercom cracked with a tension that every frequent traveler instantly recognized. It was not the calm, polished tone usually used to announce beverage service or the expected arrival time. It was different, tight, urgent, almost trembling. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is any combat pilot on board, please press your call button immediately. For a moment, the entire aircraft fell into stunned silence. Thousands of feet above the earth, somewhere between two cities, more than 200 passengers froze in their seats. A few people exchanged confused glances. Others nervously laughed, assuming it was some kind of strange joke. But no one laughed for long, because the fear in the flight attendant's voice was unmistakably real. In Seat 8A, a tired-looking single father slowly opened his eyes. His name was Daniel Carter. To the passengers around him, he looked like nothing special, just another exhausted dad traveling alone with his 6-year-old daughter curled up against his arm. His clothes were simple, his hair slightly unkempt. The dark circles under his eyes told a story of sleepless nights and quiet struggles. But when he heard the announcement, something deep inside him stirred awake, the kind of instinct that never truly leaves a person. Daniel gently looked down at his daughter, Lily, who was sleeping peacefully with her tiny hand wrapped around his hoodie sleeve. She had fallen asleep almost instantly after takeoff, clutching the stuffed bear she refused to travel without. He carefully adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. Then he pressed the call button. Before the story continues, take a quick second to like the video, comment where you're watching from, share this story with someone who believes in kindness and second chances, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that ordinary people often carry extraordinary pasts. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle within seconds. Her professional smile couldn't hide the anxiety in her eyes. When she reached Seat 8A, Daniel simply looked up and said quietly that he used to fly combat aircraft years ago. The woman blinked in surprise. She clearly hadn't expected the calm father sitting beside a sleeping child to be the person she was searching for. Within moments, she asked him to follow her. Daniel hesitated for a second, not because he was afraid, but because he looked at Lily again. He carefully woke the elderly woman sitting across the aisle and politely asked if she could keep an eye on his daughter for a few minutes. The woman nodded instantly, sensing the seriousness of the situation. Daniel then stood up and followed the flight attendant toward the cockpit. The deeper they walked into the aircraft, the heavier the atmosphere became. Passengers whispered. Some people began praying quietly. Others gripped their armrests as anxiety spread like invisible smoke through the cabin. When the cockpit door opened, Daniel stepped into a scene that immediately explained everything. One of the pilots was slumped sideways in his seat, the captain. His face was pale and his breathing shallow. The CO pilot, barely in his 30s, was gripping the controls with shaking hands. Sweat covered his forehead. Medical emergencies were one thing, but the CO pilot had another problem. A system malfunction warning flashed across multiple panels. Several navigation systems had partially shut down after what appeared to be an electrical fault. The plane was still flying, but something critical had clearly gone wrong. The young CO pilot looked at Daniel with desperation. He explained that he had never handled a situation like this without the captain. Air traffic control was trying to help, but the malfunction was complicating things. They needed someone with real combat flight experience. Someone who had trained for high-pressure situations where decisions had to be made in seconds. Daniel studied the instruments quietly. His hands rested calmly on the back of the captain's seat. Inside his chest, however, a storm of memories began to rise. Because Daniel Carter had once been one of the best fighter pilots in the Air Force. Years ago, his name had been spoken with respect across multiple squadrons. He had flown dangerous missions in hostile skies, made impossible landings, and saved lives more times than he could count. But life had changed, war had ended, and tragedy had found him at home. His wife Emily had died unexpectedly from a sudden illness 3 years earlier, leaving Daniel alone with a newborn daughter and a heart that felt permanently shattered. Flying stopped making sense after that. The sky had once been his purpose, but Lily became his reason to stay on the ground. So he left the military quietly, turned down offers from private aviation companies, and built a much simpler life focused entirely on raising his daughter. No glory, no headlines, just bedtime stories, school lunches, and learning how to braid a little girl's hair. Now, standing inside the cockpit again, Daniel felt two worlds collide. The past and the present. The CO pilot asked him if he thought he could help. Daniel looked out through the cockpit windshield at the endless ocean of clouds glowing under the afternoon sun. Then he nodded once. The next 30 minutes would become the most intense flight many of those passengers would ever experience. Air traffic control guided them toward the nearest large airport, but the damaged systems made navigation unpredictable. One of the hydraulic response indicators also began showing irregular readings, which meant the aircraft might not handle normally during descent. Daniel's mind switched into the calm, razor-focused state that had once saved him in combat zones. Every movement was deliberate, every decision calculated. The CO pilot followed his instructions carefully as they adjusted altitude and stabilized the aircraft. Daniel worked through the failing system step by step, prioritizing what mattered most, keeping the aircraft steady and controllable. Meanwhile, back in seat 8A, Lily slowly woke up. She looked around, confused when she realized her father wasn't there. The elderly woman across the aisle gently reassured her that her dad was helping the pilots fly the airplane. Lily didn't fully understand what that meant, but she knew something important. Her daddy always helped people, and she believed that meant everything would be okay. As the aircraft began its descent, turbulence started shaking the plane harder than expected. Passengers gasped, overhead bins rattled, one sharp drop sent a wave of fear through the cabin. But inside the cockpit, Daniel remained calm. He had flown through missile warnings, night storms, and situations where survival depended on instincts built over thousands of hours in the sky. Compared to those moments, fear had already lost its power over him long ago. The runway finally came into view through the cockpit window, a long stretch of asphalt waiting far below. But the malfunction still posed a risk. Landing required perfect timing and delicate control. Daniel guided the CO pilot through each step carefully. Speed adjustments, flap positions, angle of descent, every second stretched into eternity. Passengers held their breath. And then, the wheels touched the runway, hard but controlled. The plane bounced once, then settled as the brakes engaged and the engines reversed power. A thunderous wave of applause exploded inside the cabin. Some passengers cried, others hugged strangers sitting beside them. It was the sound of hundreds of people realizing they were safe. Back in seat 8A, Lily clapped her tiny hands excitedly because everyone else was clapping. She still didn't fully understand what had just happened. All she knew was that airplanes were fun. When the aircraft finally stopped, emergency vehicles surrounded the runway. Medical teams rushed aboard to help the captain, and Daniel quietly slipped out of the cockpit. He didn't look for attention. He didn't wait for praise. He simply walked back down the aisle towards seat 8A. Lily saw him first. Her face lit up like the sunrise. She jumped out of her seat and ran straight into his arms. Daniel hugged her tightly, lifting her off the ground as she asked if he had helped fly the plane. He smiled and nodded. The elderly woman who had watched Lily looked at Daniel with tears in her eyes. Around them, passengers slowly realized that the quiet father walking back to his seat had just helped save everyone on board. People started applauding again, but Daniel looked slightly embarrassed. He simply sat back down, buckled his seatbelt, and brushed Lily's hair away from her face. Because to him, the most important mission had always been right there in seat 8A. Before we reach the end of this story, here's a small request. If this moment touched your heart even a little, please comment the word hero below so we can see how many people believe that real heroes often look like ordinary parents sitting quietly beside their children. After the passengers disembarked, airport officials and airline staff tried to speak with Daniel. Reporters were already waiting near the terminal doors after hearing what had happened. But Daniel politely declined interviews. He didn't want cameras. He didn't want attention. He had a connecting flight to catch and a daughter who wanted ice cream. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who walk away quietly after doing what needed to be done. As Daniel and Lily left the airport together, hand in hand, the sun was setting across the horizon. The sky glowed the same color it had during countless missions Daniel once flew. But this time felt different, because he wasn't flying toward danger anymore. He was simply walking home with the person who had saved him, Lily. And if this story reminded you that courage, sacrifice, and kindness still exist in the world today, please like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that prove ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Because somewhere out there, Another quiet hero might be sitting in seat 8A,